That's really important that that happens on September 10th. So the debates are part of our historical legacy, but not for that long. They're not written in law, and we, the people, have to insist that they happen in order to have more informed choices.
Why do you think that the evolution has really become that they've become such a mainstream component of campaigning?
Well, I think we could see it this year. The candidates, well, Trump accepted, but in general, the candidates are so scripted. They only come out in controlled environments that is most advantageous to them. They often only do media interviews with favorable reporters. They have prepared talking points. They know what they're going to experience when they go out on in front of a podium.
Hmm.
But the debates are spontaneous.
Hmm.
Anything can happen. And we
Hmm.
saw it. I mean, obviously the Biden debate is history changing. The
Yeah.
first the Biden Trump debate this year led to the latest dropping of a presidential candidate in history.
Yeah.
So I think the fact that anything can happen, that they're spontaneous, that they're unscripted, all of these things contribute to the fact that the American people just are kind of riveted by them.
Yeah, and historically, I mean, this last debate that really changed the conditions of the campaign. Besides that, historically, have debates really moved the needle for one candidate or another? Like, were there certain instances where before and after debate, and I guess maybe you already mentioned Kennedy versus Nixon, but are there other examples of when debates really mattered to outcomes?
Oh, absolutely. There's so many instances. Or there's the famous Rick Perry oops moment. That's in the primaries, but that's when he revealed that he didn't know the three agencies he was going to get rid
Oh,
of if he were
yeah.
president. That kind of destroyed his campaign right there. Gerald Ford in 1976 says there's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Well, that was news to the Eastern Europeans. And he was actually gaining on Carter. He had Carter was in the lead, but Ford was gaining on Carter at the time of that gaffe, and that really slowed his momentum. And the election ended up being razor thin. And there are those in the Ford camp who think that without that gaffe, he would have overtaken Carter.
And given the fact that debates do potentially do have the impact to kind of be these unforgettable moments, besides the moments you mentioned, do you have kind of like favorite unforgettable moments of debates in
I
the
mean,
past?
so many, we could spend the whole hour talking about them. But in 1992, when you have Admiral Stockdale is the third party candidate who was
Oh,
a Vietnam veteran, had served many years in Vietnamese POW camps,
yeah.
and he um, he gets up there and he sort of says, after the other two candidates who are Gore and Quayle are fighting, he says, "Who am I? What am I doing here?" And everybody in America wondered, who is he and what is he doing there? So yeah, that was a legendary moment. Another great vice presidential debate moment was Al Gore versus Jack Kemp. And Jack Kemp was known as kind of a keeper of the conservative intellectual flame, but he didn't prepare for the
Hmm.
debate. In fact, he said, I don't have to prepare for a debate with Al Gore, and was very dismissive. Well, Gore destroyed him in that debate, and it was really ugly. And it kind of ended Kemp's status as a darling of the conservative intellectual right. So, yeah, there have been a lot of really important moments. Walter Mondale in 1984 gained some momentum in his
Yeah.
first debate against Reagan, where he did pretty well.
Yeah.
In the second debate, the age question came up, and he famously said, and you already know what I'm going to say, but Reagan said, I'm not going to exploit for partisan purposes the youth and inexperience of my opponent.
Yeah.
Everybody laughed, including Mondale, but inside he was crying because Mondale revealed that he knew at that moment that he had lost the presidential election.
Yeah, that for me, I think that's my favorite moment in kind of presidential debate history was Ronald Reagan's response at that time.
And there's
Um,
a great backstory to that. Reagan doesn't do well in the first debate. He has a
uh-huh.
horrible debate prep with all these advisors just yelling stuff at him and trying to cram his head with statistics. And that just was not Reagan's strong suit. And the chief of staff of the Reagan White House, James Baker, brings in Roger Ailes, who was a terrible person and did awful things to women. We can all acknowledge that. But he was a brilliant TV strategic mind. And he
Mm,
looks at the Reagan debate prep and says, this is not working. And he kicks everybody out of the room. And he just tries to engage Reagan in what he calls a game of pepper, where they kind of go back and forth and talk about themes and not getting into all the details and all the statistics. And Reagan gets more comfortable. And then Al says to him, the age thing is going to come up. And Reagan kind of gets a twinkle in his eye and says, yeah, I've got a plan for that. And so it sounded spontaneous, but Reagan had thought about in advance what he was going to say.
And in terms of the history of debates, there's this idea that there's a curse of the first debate of incumbent candidates, that it typically doesn't go very well, that debate. I remember back to Obama's incumbent debate with Romney, when he had a really tough time, and apparently he himself even called his debate performance a stinker. Do you think that this curse of the incumbent's first debate is really a thing?
It's absolutely a thing. There's only one exception to it. Well, I'll mention it in a second, but we already talked about some of the stinker performances. 1976, Ford makes his big gaffe about the Eastern domination or the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. 1980, Carter runs into Reagan, and Reagan says, there you go again, about one of Carter's misrepresentations of Reagan's record. 1984, I already mentioned that Reagan looked old in his first debate. He did recover. 1992, George H.W. Bush does not do well in any of his debates against Bill Clinton. And then we also mentioned George W. Bush in 2004 does poorly in his first debate against John Kerry. He does rally and does better in subsequent debates. And then you mentioned the Obama in 2012. And then also Trump in 2020 has that shouty debate against Biden, where he doesn't let Biden talk. And a lot of observers thought that if he had let Biden talk, people would have seen back then that Biden might not have been fully up to the job, but Trump wouldn't let it go. Now, I skipped one, and astute presidential election historians will notice I skipped one. I skipped 1996, when Bill Clinton debates Bob Dole. And Bill Clinton was just a superior political athlete. And the curse of the incumbent or no curse of the incumbent, Bill Clinton wasn't losing a presidential debate, and he didn't. So Dole was seen as incredibly old at the time. I think he was 72 or 73. Not that old these days, I guess. But Dole just wasn't ready for again, the superior political talent of Bill Clinton. And I think that's a once in a generation type of talent. But I think we should talk about why.
Yeah, that's what I was going to follow up with, was why do you think there is a curse of the incumbent, or why are those performances typically poor performances?
Because when you're in the White House, you're in a bubble. You are told, yes, Mr. President, you're great, Mr. President, everything's wonderful, Mr. President. Nobody really gives it to you straight. And you're not used to non-deferential behavior. And here you get on stage with somebody who's usually equally politically talented, who is fiercely competitive, and who wants to take you down. And you haven't had experience with anyone like that in 4+ years since your last debates that got you there. And it takes time to kind of reset and get ready for that kind of thing. Now, as I said, some presidents who do poorly in the first debate did reset and do better afterwards. Obama, for example, Bush, George W. Bush, for example, Reagan, for example. But a lot of these others, they faltered in that first debate, and either there wasn't another debate like Carter against Reagan, or they just didn't recover in the subsequent debates like George H.W. Bush. And so it's a fraught with peril moment for incumbents.
And historically, also, I'm curious, are primary debates as significant as general debates, and as are the vice presidential debates as I guess it can never be really as significant as the presidential, but do they have weight, those kind of other debates that precede the presidential debates in the campaigns?
Yeah, well, let's take them separately. First of all, the primary debates are less impactful because fewer people are watching. Something like 60 to 70 million people watch a presidential debate. Something like 10 million people watch a nomination debate. But they are important because they tell you who the candidates are going to be, except this year when Trump didn't bother to appear in the debates. But in general, if you do well in the debates, and look, the fact is that in 2016, Trump really did wipe the floor with his opponents in those debates, and nobody really expected it. They kind of saw him as off to the side, as kind of this sideshow candidate, that he wasn't really relevant. And he really did a great job in those debates. I mean, he is a natural performer. He's also had more experience in front of the TV camera than almost anyone else in American life, political or otherwise.
Mhm.
And he really, I mean, he really just emerged. I called him earlier the Cy Young of American political debates because he's now been in more political debates at the presidential level than anybody else in our history. So so I think the primary debates can make a candidate. Romney did pretty well in his debates in 2012. He was probably the favorite, but Rick Perry, as I said earlier, was coming on strong, and then he had his oops moment. So you can kind of collapse in a debate. Remember the famous Chris Christie evisceration of Marco Rubio. So the primary debates are important that they set the table for who the candidates are going to be. But
Mhm.
the general election debates determine who the winner is, who is the eventual president. So I think obviously those are more important. Then you asked about the vice presidential debate.
Mhm.
I think there have been some amazing vice presidential debates. I think the Cheney-Lieberman debate in
Uh-huh.
2000, shout out to the Lieberman program that you work for, but the Cheney-Lieberman debate in 2000 was one of the best debates I've ever seen in my lifetime at any level. That
Mhm.
was just two really talented, respectful people who celebrated our institutions, just talking about issues, and they didn't get nasty with each other. And I think the American people thought better of both of them after that session.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have a real takedown. I thought Cheney, and I was involved in the debate prep with him in 2004. I mean, he really destroyed Edwards in 2004. You had Dan Quayle's reputation was set forever when Lloyd Benson said, "I knew Jack Kennedy, you're no Jack Kennedy." And Quayle had telegraphed that he was using that Kennedy comparison. So the Benson people were ready for it and they
Yeah.
blasted him with that. I already mentioned Jack Kemp and his inability to prepare for debates, and we're going to talk about debate prep a little bit, but it's really important to prepare for these things. You can't take them lightly, and I think that really hurt Kemp.
Yeah.
There's no way Dole was going to win that election against Clinton in '96, but Kemp really hurt himself and his historical reputation by his poor performance there. So the vice presidential debates matter, but they
Mhm.
don't determine the result of the presidential elections.
Got it. Yeah, I thought the Lieberman, when he was trying to point out that Cheney did a lot of work in the private sector, was making a lot of money in the private sector, and then said like, as he always, God bless his soul, talked about his wife, was like, Hadassah would, or my wife would really like me to work in the private sector. He said this during the debate. And then Cheney said, like, I'm trying to get you there, or something
Yeah,
like
that was a great line.
that, which I thought was really funny. And I really appreciated that the kind of quipping back and forth was still had class and it wasn't demeaning to one another, um, as it has kind of become, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah, I
Uh,
wonder if we should make the Cheney-Lieberman debate mandatory viewing for all new Lieberman scholars.
there's a lot of mandatory Lieberman viewing. Even him in Senate hearings, the way that he spoke to other people, there's a lot. He was quite the man.
Right, but that was probably the event in which he was seen by more Americans than any other thing he ever did in his career.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course he mentioned, oh no, wait, yeah, he mentioned his mother. He like thanked his mother at the beginning, and even in his acceptance speech, he thanked his. No, he said, behind every successful man is a surprised mother-in-law, I think." In any case, I'd really like to talk the next section that I kind of wanted to talk about that I'm really excited to learn about because I don't know as anywhere as much as you do from your wealth of experience is about debate prep. I find it really fascinating because we hear a lot about debate prep. Like Tulsi Gabbard right now is apparently busy preparing Trump. Kamala has set up shop in Pennsylvania, prepping between campaign stops, apparently. So, how do candidates prepare for debates?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's lots written about. I've written articles about it. There's a lot that goes into preparing for a presidential debate. In fact, I did
Hmm.
presidential debate prep in the 2004 campaign for Bush and Cheney,
Hmm.
and it's an amazing amount of work. We were given this assignment of preparing the debate books for Bush and Cheney. And I still remember on the first day, the guy I was reporting to who had done the job that I had the cycle before, I said, I just don't understand. There's 4,000 possible questions. I don't even know how to begin this process. And he said, you're right, there's 4,000 possible questions, but there's only 40 answers. Your job is to write those 40 answers. And everything can fit into
Mm-hmm.
that bubble of the 40 answers. And that's the idea. And you've got to memorize them. And
Mm-hmm.
we started out with kind of long form descriptions of each issue, and then
Mm-hmm.
boil it down to bullet points, and then we would boil it down to just really small talking points. And then we basically boiled it down to shorthand. So everything was on an index card, and the president could flip through his index cards and know each of those 40 answers cold. So
Mm-hmm.
part of it is just getting a sense of what you want to say. And so there's rarely a question where a president is completely surprised that comes out of left field that nobody knows is coming. Everything is in those 40 rubrics.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's step one. But then you've got to go up against the opponent. And so you've had a lot of very talented politicians who play the role of the opponent. I worked a number of times with Rob Portman, and he was a senator from Ohio, but before that he did a lot of this debate prep, and he played John Edwards in 2004 in the debate prep with Cheney, and he embodied Edwards. I mean, he sounded like him. He told the same kind of stories as him. He didn't put on the full-on accent because that would have sounded ridiculous, but the cadences of the way he spoke. And he actually had a huge role in 2000 when he played Al Gore
Mm-hmm.
in the debates prep for George W. Bush. And in one of the debate prep sessions,
Mm-hmm.
he goes right up to George W. Bush, gets right in his face, and Bush leans forward and kisses Portman on the head when Portman does that. And Bush says, he's not going to do that. And Portman says, he will do it. I've seen him watch him. And sure enough, in the second debate, Al Gore kind of stalked George W. Bush. And Gore was a big, imposing guy, and
Uh-huh.
it's sort of an alpha male move, and it was meant to intimidate Bush. But Bush
Mm-hmm.
was ready, and he was not intimidated. And he kind of gave this head check, like acknowledging that Gore was there, but
Yeah.
showing that he was not at all intimidated by him.
Yeah.
And that was the moment in which he won that particular debate.
Mm-hmm.
So the debate prepsters are very important.
How many people are on a debate prep team?
Yeah, that varies.
Uh-huh.
Usually have kind of a core person who leads it. There's a guy named Ron Klain, who was chief of staff in the Biden White House, who is the #1 prepster on the Democratic side, and he's done multiple campaign cycles. But there's usually a team of you've got the research person and you've got the media person. So if it's more than 10, you've got a problem.
Okay.
But it can't just be one.
Yeah, and I'm curious those answers that you would come up with, those 40 answers. To what extent are those answers um are the answers really kind of content answers versus like strategy answers? So, is it kind of what we want to do is highlight what our opponent hasn't done, or is it more about like the actual policy that they want to highlight? And not even just like the what my opponent hasn't done, but in general, kind of strategic ways of communicating versus just saying the facts.
So in each one of those answers, there's a core answer. There's a question, Mr. President, your education policy is not working, or your Iraq policy is not working. You've got to respond to that. So
Uh,
that's the response. But then there's the pivot. And the
okay.
pivot is towards either making some offensive point about what you're going to do, or attacking the opponent and putting the opponent on the defensive. So it's always response, pivot, response, pivot.
Okay. And to what extent is the prep, like how micromanaged are the candidates in their guidance in terms of how to behave? I remember reading, apparently was a case it was the case when Sarah Palin was debating Joe Biden in her debate prep, that she couldn't stop saying oh Biden, calling him oh Biden. So her debate, the people who were prepping her just said, just call him Joe. And that actually ended up with her tagline when she met him. She said, can I call you Joe? And that became like her folksy, like it actually ended up kind of being really good for her because it showed how American she was and folksy. But like, to what extent are candidates really like that micromanaged?
Well, Sarah Palin, you have to remember, was a candidate with no preparation for this kind of stuff, who was thrown on the national scene with very little warning and preparation. So she really wasn't ready for primetime. She hadn't gone through, usually the debate, the vice president is someone who's gone through debates at the presidential nomination level. They didn't make it, but they know how to do this. So I think she required more micromanaging
Hmm.
than other candidates, but generally you're giving a larger strategic vision. Trump, for example, in 2020 was
Hmm.
advised by multiple advisors, let Biden talk, just let him talk.
Hmm.
But Chris Christie, who's the debate prep guy who played Biden, was so nasty to Trump to try to prepare Trump that Trump got really, really mad. And when he was performing in that debate, in the actual debate, he was almost attacking Christie as Biden more than he was attacking Biden. And so he didn't follow the strategic guidance of his advisors.
Hmm.
But really, it's at a higher level. It's not always that kind of low level micromanage.
Hmm.
Now, there are quips that are prepared, and the best quips are obviously spontaneous, but sometimes you have ideas that you're formulating in advance, like I mentioned with Reagan and the age thing, or Lloyd Benson getting ready for the Jack Kennedy pounce. So
Hmm.
I think that's part of it too, and that's a form of micromanagement, I guess.
Hmm. Are they also guided in terms of nonverbal? So, for instance, like when Trump
Absolutely.
had his infamous like stalking of Hillary, do you think that's something that physically he was told to kind of physically puff himself out and follow her around? Or in general, I guess, are candidates guided in the nonverbal as well?
Yeah, I mean, so a very good friend of mine is a guy named Brett O'Donnell, who
Yeah.
is the Republican equivalent of Ron Klain. He is the number one debate prep guy on the Republican side. And he always coaches in the nonverbal, smile, uh, don't roll your eyes. I mean, Al Gore got in trouble in 2000 when he was rolling his eyes too much at George W. Bush, and Saturday Night Live made fun of him. Uh, show, stand up straight. I mean, there's all kinds of nonverbal advice that is given to candidates, and the visual is what matters. I mean, Roger Ailes, I hate to cite him again because he was again a bad person, but
Hmm.
he would assess guests for Fox News by watching them with the sound off,
Mm,
and he would
interesting.
determine if they looked engaging enough to put on TV. So I think the nonverbal stuff in a visual medium like television is so important.
Something else I find really fascinating when listening to the news about the debates is also the kind of negotiation of these prearranged rules of the debates. How the debate will be handled. For instance, right now there's a negotiation or a discussion of like, will the microphones be on or off? Or whether the candidates stand or sit, are they close to each other with the podiums? And I actually remember Senator Lieberman said about the vice presidential debate that you brought up, that apparently the negotiating teams didn't come to him as it didn't frame it as an option. They just said, we're going to sit. It's going to be done sitting. And he thought it was strange because all the debates he had done before, he was standing, but he said, oh, okay, it's fine. It's not a question, then fine. But found out afterwards that actually that was just kind of a strategy to come to him with it as if it was already a decision. And that sitting actually really helped them to be kind of moderate in the way that they interacted with one another. So I guess I'm just curious, how do these rules get negotiated? What is really up for debate in terms of, for lack of a better word, what is up for debate in the actual kind of setup? And how much do these things kind of influence the debate?
Yeah, everything is up for negotiations. The temperature in the room, the size of the podiums. Sometimes you have a candidate who likes a colder room versus a warmer room. The size of the podiums can be important because we do have a history of the taller candidate most often winning, not always, but most often winning. And
Uh-huh.
so you don't want to have too much of a podium disparity if you have a much shorter candidate like Mike Dukakis was in '88 against George H.W. Bush. Uh, the standing versus sitting is important. Some people like the town hall debate. Bill Clinton was brilliant at the town hall style because he felt your pain. George H.W. Bush was not comfortable in town hall. And in fact, he had the famous look at his watch incident in that debate. He claims that he was trying to say that Clinton was over time, and that's why he looked at the watch. But the
Hmm.
American people looked at it and said, this guy's bored and he wants to be somewhere else.
Which is
So
funny. It was probably just habitual. It wasn't. But his debate preppers should have said, "Don't wear a watch," if they saw him habitually looking at his watch, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, never look at your debate. Free debate advice for everyone. No, never look at your watch in a debate.
Yeah, I'm wondering also, what kind of broadly, what do you think makes a good debate performance? How much of it is actually content, and how much are we looking at how they respond, their behavior kind of generally?
There's
What
two
do
things that matter in debates: message and moments.
you,
You have a
okay.
message, you're trying to get it out there. I'm the candidate that's for fiscal responsibility or ending the war or whatever it is. You want that message out there and you want to fold that into multiple answers, whatever your top line message is. And then moments. There are moments like Bush head checking Gore or the you're no Jack Kennedy or whatever these moments are. You want to have a couple of takeaway moments.
Mm.
My friend Brett was the debate advisor for Ron DeSantis. And if you watch DeSantis's performances in the primaries, technically he was excellent. He always was on message. He always answered the right thing. He never stumbled. He knew what he was doing, but he
Hmm.
never had any great moments. And it's hard to generate the moments. You have to have it's a different type of talent. DeSantis is very bright and a good study and was willing to do the work, but he had trouble generating those moments. And I would talk to Brett about it. I'd say he just did, he's not getting any big moment. He said, I know, but it's hard that there's an innate talent to it. But if you have the talent, it can be coached for you to get it out.
What are those moments? What are some of examples of kind of different types of those moments? So you said like Clinton, for instance, in the town hall. I'm assuming he would have great moments kind of interacting with people because he came
He
off as
felt your pain.
authentic, or
Yeah.
what was great.
He felt your pain. That was his thing. I feel your pain. So
And
there's
it's
this famous
that,
answer where
yeah.
George H.W. Bush is asked this. It's really a terrible question by an audience member about how the deficit personally affects you. And it's not really a question that can be answered. And Bush stumbled and didn't really understand the question. And Clinton didn't care about the deficit part of the question. He just he went and talked to the woman and explained how he felt the pain and that just showed that he cared. And so that was a good moment. Obviously, there were bad moments too, like Al Gore's mugging for the camera and the eye rolling and the faces that he was making at George W. Bush. So there's different types of moments, but the
Mhm.
things that you remember from the campaign, the Kamala Harris and Mike Pence debate, unfortunately, I think is only remembered for that fly that was on Pence's white hair that
That, yeah,
that people noticed and talked about.
yeah.
Other than that, it was a relatively unmemorable debate, although I guess we'll talk about her in a little bit. But she seems to have a go-to move, which is to kind of complain that her opponent is mansplaining. And she says, I'm talking, I'm speaking. And and the mansplaining thing doesn't really work in a debate because it's a debate. You're supposed to explain your point of view. And so I would think that Trump would need to prepare himself to push back on that and say it's not mansplaining, it's a debate.
Yeah.
And you can't go and ask Vladimir Putin not to interrupt you, and you can't go to Vladimir Putin and say, "Oh no, he's mansplaining." So I think that if you're ready for it, there's a way to turn that around.
Hmm.
But it clearly is one of her go-to moves.
And before we get to them, which we'll get to in a second, I'm just curious, historically, which presidents do you think kind of delivered in terms of debates, and which were kind of the on the other side of the scale? So they were both able to answer the questions in terms of content, and they were moment generating, and the opposite.
Well, Reagan was great in 80 and 84. He had the "there you go again" moment with Carter in 80 and the age question in 84. Uh, Bill Clinton was always good in debates. He just nailed it. Uh, Perhaps the best one of the presidential debaters. Uh, George W. Bush did pretty well in 2000 against Al Gore, although less well in 04 against John Kerry. Uh, Trump's had some good moments. I thought he did a good performance against Biden the first time in this cycle, but largely because he let Biden talk. And in the 2020 election, did a terrible job because he didn't let Biden talk. And so I think he may have learned his lesson there. In fact, there's actually a great line that Trump could use against Harris because his best line in the Biden debate this time around was Biden was not that articulate, it was kind of blathering. And Trump said at one point, I have no idea what he just said, and I don't think he knows what he just said. And given Harris's tendency to do the word salad and to say weird things that don't seem to be coherent, he could probably recycle that line against her. I don't know what you just said, and you don't know what you just said either. And it could actually work if he has the right moment for it. You can't just throw it out there, but it has to be at the right time.
Yeah. Isn't there a line too when some things can come off kind of derogatory versus like there's some like there's fine line where a quip is like a good quip versus when it comes off kind of derogatory. And
Yeah, like Obama, when he said to Hillary, "You're likable enough," that sounded nasty, and people didn't like it. Now, obviously, he recovered and won the nomination and then the election, but that one sounded like it was just a little too rough.
yeah, and so now that we are like kind of headed into this debate, I know you've just mentioned some of the things that you think are might play out, but how do you think this debate is going to play out?
So with Trump, there's a huge variation. I said that sometimes he's too aggressive, and then sometimes he lets the other person talk. He's never going to be completely coherent, meaning that he talks around issues rather than directly at them. I
Mm.
have to think that that's a strategy. That's just the way he likes talking about things. But I often find it frustrating. I know what he's trying to say, but he doesn't actually say it. Uh, with Harris, she is not good extemporaneously. And we've seen that she's actually a better performer than we thought with a script and getting up and giving a prepared speech. But she just has this reputation as not being good extemporaneously. She's nervous, she's not sure of herself, and she goes in circles a little bit when she talks and spouts cliches.
Hmm.
Trump's got to get her to start doing that. I think there are also huge variations in her positions, right?
Hmm.
So she said in 2020, in 2020, when she was running for president, she was absolutely against fracking. And
Yeah.
now she's put out a statement that she didn't actually put out, but an advisor called the press and said she wouldn't ban fracking. Um, and on Israel, which is of interest to the people on this call, I thought her statement after Hamas brutally slaughtered 6 hostages, including an American. I thought the statement was terrific. I thought John Podhoretz at commentary could have written it, talked about how evil Hamas was and how they must be defeated. But when she talks about it, again, extemporaneously, she doesn't have that kind of hard, straight, clear moral approach to the issue. She always says, Israel has a right to defend itself, but she's always doing the but thing. So I think Trump, if he's going to be successful, has to draw her out on where she actually is on the Israel issue, where she
Hmm.
actually is on the fracking issue. And
Hmm.
again, there's a whole bunch of issues where it's just not clear where she is. She took a very left-wing positions in 2020 when she was trying to run for president, when she was a California senator. But her campaign has suggested that she no longer has those positions. Well, let's hear what she actually says on those things. And then her response in the CNN interview, I didn't think was very strong, where she said, "My values have not changed." Well, what does
Hmm.
that mean? That
Yeah.
means you changed your position, but you kept the same values. I mean, I'm sure some
Yeah.
high-priced consultant came up with that, but I didn't think it was very effective.
Yeah, and I also think that she was kind of being spoon-fed some explanations. Like the interviewer said, "Well, did you just gain more experience? Did you get more data?" Like all of which would have sounded like it would make sense. Like, okay, I'm older now and wiser, and this is how I changed my mind. So that was interesting, and I'm curious, kind of on that point. Um, in your opinion, if let's start with Kamala, if she's smart or strategic, how do you think she should deal with kind of the hot button issues that she's likely to get questions about? Like, for instance, the fracking question will probably come up since it's been now shown that she kind of switched her position. Um, and also the question of Israel, and the support of Israel, and any other of the kind of hot button issues. And how do you think if she's smart, how do you think she should respond to these?
I think she has to say, my position is clear, and say what the position is.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a change, you have to give some explanation of why. Look, Trump changes positions all the time. But people expect that of him. Uh, I think she needs to say, I was from California, I don't think fracking is right for my state, but I recognize that Pennsylvania, it's very important and we want to be an energy independent. So I think there are ways to explain it,
Mm-hmm.
have to do the explanation.
Mm-hmm. And if she kind of evades explanation, that would not be good for her. If she continually evades that.
Yeah, if it looks like she's flip-flopping and there's no reason for it, then I don't think that's good for her.
Yeah. And then I guess so similarly for Trump, what do you think are going to be the kind of hot button or most pressing things he's going to be asked about? And if he is smart, how do you think he should reply?
Yeah, well, Trump just has to get his emotions in check. If he's too nasty, that's a problem, especially going against a female candidate. If he interrupts her, that's going to be a problem. So he needs to be a little cooler, which, isn't always easy for him. I also think he needs to explain how left-wing many of her positions are. And I also think he has to get back to this idea that Reagan was very successful with in 1980 with, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And say, Americans were better off when I was president, and now we've got two hot wars, and America's not respected around the world, and inflation's really high, and you need to understand that if you go back to me, I can bring us back to where we were. Now, I don't know that he can, but
Mm-hmm.
I think giving people a sense of comfort. Also, there's all this talk about the end of democracy and how terrible Trump is, and he doesn't respect institutions. You say, look, I was president for 4 years. The Republic still stood. At the end of the day, I left office on January 20th like I was supposed to. People make me out to be this caricature, but I'm kind of within the boundaries of American politics.
Mm-hmm.
Make the American people not scared of him, I think is the answer.
And is it similarly, how do you think um Walz and Vance will kind of do what will be the main things people will be looking for in the presidential debate?
Yeah, this debate is a total wild card, maybe the biggest wild card I've ever seen in history, because neither of these guys were running for president previously. Walls, nobody knew anything about. Vance, people only know about him because of his famous memoir, The Hillbilly Elegy. And so both of them are huge unknowns. Both of them have made problematic statements or had problematic policies.
Mhm.
Both of them have shown a willingness to be nasty towards one another. So this debate is, grab the popcorn, folks. I really can't wait to see this one, if it
Okay.
happens.
And I think that's all of the questions that I have. I wanted to open up the questions in the chat. I know that there are some already that we can start taking. So our first question is, when did the primary debate start?
Yeah, so the primary process really gets serious in 1972 when under McGovern they rewrote the rules so that the primaries would determine who wins the election. It used to be the primaries were kind of indicators for the people in the smoke-filled room. And so you don't have primaries to the same degree right then. In 1980, there was a hugely important primary debate with Reagan and George H.W. Bush, where Reagan wanted the other candidates who were in the primary in New Hampshire on stage, and George H.W. Bush didn't. And then there's kind of this melee in the debate hall in New Hampshire, and Reagan's campaign, who sponsored the debate, said when they try and interrupt him, he says, I paid for this microphone, Mr. Green. The guy's name was actually not Green, it was Breen. But that was a powerful moment, and that really helped Reagan propel himself. So we've had these primary debates for over 40 years now.
We have another question from the chat. Could you please give some examples of how Harris could or should go for Trump or respond to him?
Well, I think she's had that good line about Donald Trump commits felonies and I put people who commit felonies away or something like that. She was a prosecutor. Highlight that prosecutor thing. Sometimes it's not popular with the Democratic base to talk about the prosecution, but I think Trump's various legal jeopardies make him vulnerable there. At the same time, she's got to be careful not to do too much on it because, in many ways, the Alvin Bragg indictment propelled Trump to the Republican nomination because people thought that was an unfair case. And this notion of lawfare against political opponents really is not that popular among the American people. So I think she has an opportunity to show Trump's disrespect for the law without making it seem like she's going to be the prosecutor in chief who's going to put handcuffs on him right there on stage.
Do you think that the energy of the debate is going to be different than he was with Hillary? Meaning, I think, he was imposing and kind of physically walking behind her. Do you think he's going to take a different strategy in terms of how he kind of approaches this debate?
Yeah, I think there's a danger for Trump in that he's considerably older than she is. Right? Hillary and Joe Biden were both of his generation, but he's much older and she's younger and can appear more vibrant potentially. But she has a physical challenge too, which is she's really short. And she's about she's about the size of James Madison. I think she's under 5'4", and Trump is I think 6'2". So he could look imposing next to her, and that could be a danger for her as well.
So you think he might kind of lay off the physicalness of the debate?
I think he has to show how imposing he is and how large he is without being rude or
Yeah.
disrespectful.
Yeah, well, that would be good. Yeah. We have another question. What do you think is the, strategic importance of raising or lowering the bar of an opponent's debate skills? So, for instance, I was watching an interview with Tulsi Gabbard, who was talking about the debate prep, and she was saying how Kamala is a formidable candidate and that she's had a lot of experience. And, I was wondering while I was watching this, is this strategically something that the Trump team is putting out to kind of raise the bar of Kamala's ability? Is that it kind of something that the campaigns do?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. This is something called the expectations game, where you
uh-huh.
put it out there, oh, my opponent's the most brilliant debater since Cicero, and I'm just a humble lawyer from, East Texas or whatever. So that's a constant thing. I thought that the Trump campaign was making a mistake by uh, by denigrating Joe Biden in the lead up to the debate, because I thought that there was a chance that Biden would outperform how bad they were talking about him, but somehow Biden underperformed. I mean, his debate performance was just so colossally awful that that worked out for them. But yeah, it is a constant thing in debates that you're trying to prop up the opponent. It's the only time you try and prop up the opponent, but in the lead up to the debate, you try and say, "Oh wow, this guy's really an impressive debater," and
Mm,
just woe was me. How am I going to handle it? And then you try and outperform that.
got it. Understood.
It's part of
Do
the
we
mind game.
It's a lot of mind games. Do we have any other questions from the folks on Zoom? If you wanna, this is the last chance, the last moments to pop your question into Zoom for Tevi Troy. Okay, well, I definitely have learned so much about debates and the history of debates and the prep and the content, and I'm sure all of us. Oh, there was a question. Sorry. Yeah, Ira Katz. Will Harris talk about January 6th? Someone just put in.
I assume she will. I mean, I think that's a huge vulnerability for Trump, and I think it counteracts the case he wants to make about how he was normal and respects the boundaries. So yeah, uh, I think it's a weakness for him and a strength for her. So I think she will bring it up, and he usually in that starts talking about how unfairly the people were treated, which I don't think sells well with the American people because people have the image of that crazy guy with the horn hat, and, and abusing Nancy Pelosi's office and all that. So I don't think the American people have a lot of sympathy there.
Yeah, I guess with this, with the idea of the questions, I'm curious, does the moderator actually have a role in choosing the questions, or are they pre-chosen by CNN or whoever's hosting it? And I
The
guess
moderator is part of a team
uh,
that works on the debate questions, and they work really hard on the debate questions. I actually have a problem with the moderators. I've written about this, the Wall Street Journal. I think that the moderators try and make themselves part of the spectacle, and the best moderators, and I thought that this happened in the first Trump Biden debate this year. Uh, I think the moderators are best kind of in the background. They put out the questions and then they just leave it alone. And they shouldn't have their moments. They shouldn't fact check the candidates right then and there. Let the candidates fight it out and the American people decide.
Mhm. Okay, and we have a question. How has short form media like TikTok and Reels affected presidential debating?
I think it affects the whole campaign because now you have these moments that everybody gets to see that people wouldn't ordinarily see. When I was growing up, I saw the presidential debates when they happened, but it's not like I could go on YouTube and see old presidential debates. It just wasn't something that was available. And now you can go see anything anytime. I mean, my wife was saying to me something about the Kamala Harris and headphones, and I hadn't seen it. So I just typed in Twitter, Kamala Harris headphones. And there, I saw these images of her in the headphones, trying to pretend that she's listening to someone so she could ignore the reporters. But yeah, you have all these moments. The other side of it, though, is that some of these moments sound big when they happen, but they're ultimately forgettable and not really part of the historical narrative.
Okay, we have one more question. What do you think Hillary should have done when Trump was lurking over her in the debate?
Yeah, I think some kind of a clever quip like, "Hello, nice to see you, Donald," or
Right.
"You want to start paying rent," or something like that to indicate that he was in a place that he shouldn't be.
Yeah, or like the way that you said that George Bush did with a candidate who was kind of doing something similar, right? Didn't you
Yeah,
say
but
he,
But
yeah.
yeah, really put them in their place saying, this is my spot. You shouldn't be here. And actually she did a good job in the debate, in the Senate debate against Rick Lazio. This is already 20 years ago, when Lazio kept walking across the stage and trying to get her to sign a piece of paper, and she kind of brushed him off. And people saw Lazio as overly aggressive in that moment.
Mhm. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. I'm sure all of us will be able to watch and learn on September 10th from a new and more educated vantage point. Thank you, Tevi, for sharing your wisdom. And thank you again to Yeshiva University and the Lieberman Mitzner Center, the Strauss Center, and the Sacks-Herenstein Center for sponsoring this discussion. If you like this discussion, there is another discussion September 11th, correct? I think that's the next one. And another one after that. All of these are before the election, but election themed. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.